Hi everyone, this is FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos, and today we're going to take a look at the fourth place game in the US Chess League's 2007 Game of the Year Countdown Contest. This game is played between Grandmasters Larry Christiansen, who is representing the Boston team, and Patrick Wolff, who is playing for San Francisco. This took place in the sixth week of the season, and was a very interesting, very sharp game in which Larry Christiansen was able to demonstrate his the best aspects of his play to their finest capacity. Maybe not. Maybe that's a bit too much, but it was a very nice game in which Christiansen did show off his real flair for the attack. All right, well, let's take a look. Christiansen had white in this game, and we've got a classical Sicilian, which is a relatively rare bird in contemporary practice. Now, Wolff quit chess really, I don't know, what was it, about a decade or more ago, so it's been quite a while. It's just poking his head back up after a long time. And when he was playing regularly and was an extremely talented young player here in the U.S., I mean, he's still extremely talented, but, you know, he's a little bit older now. In any event, when he was playing, this was very popular. Anand played it, Kramnik played it, and probably just about all the top players gave it a whirl every now and then, except for perhaps Kasparov. At any rate, since this is what was popular in the day, it's probably still what Wolff knows best. I'm not sure how much time he's had to really rededicate himself to the game, so it's kind of a natural opening choice. At any rate, well, it's certainly not a bad opening by any stretch of the imagination. It does seem that white is able to get a pretty stable edge in this, and it also to really minimize black's winning chances. So for that reason, I would say that the classical system here has declined in popularity, but it's still a very important system. It's certainly playable. Irina Krush plays it, among those of you who are Americans and fans of hers. There's a player named, I believe it's Zdenko Kozul, who's also a great expert in this, and many other strong grandmasters play this. Yermolinsky, Dmitry Gurevich plays this fairly regularly, so it certainly isn't extinct, just less popular than it was in Wolff's heyday. All right, so now Christiansen plays bishop to g5, the Richter-Rouser. Sometimes people call this position the Richter-Rouser, but it's only that if white plays bishop to g5. So the proper name for the system that black is playing is the classical. All right, so continuing here, e6, queen d2, and bishop to e7. And this also is, I don't know if I would say it's so much old-fashioned, but it's not the most popular line, which is a6. So a6 is the most common variation. White castles, and then either bishop to d7 or h6 are both quite common. All right, so bishop to e7 is a little bit old-fashioned, and in fact, after both sides castle, white's knight to b3, jokingly, I would label breaking theory from 1957. So there are quite a number of famous games played by Mikhail Tal in that year, and really throughout his career where he played this system. All right, so moving along here, queen b6, very typical move, clearing d8 for the rook. f3, there's rook to d8. Queen e1, getting out of the way of the possible battery on the d file. a6. And the idea of this is that black wants to, wants to drop the queen back to c7 and then play b5 and start his queenside counterplay. And he needs to do that since here comes white on the king side. So h4, queen c7, h5, h6, bishop to e3, and now we have finally our first new move of the game. In a game played between Reshevsky and Sadie back in 1966, which is a very good year, but also an illustration of how old-fashioned this variation is, black played b5. And we had some kind of normal moves here for both sides. You can see the attack kind of going full bore here. And believe it or not, black actually managed to fend off the attack and win the game. So that's despite Reshevsky's higher rating and better title, and again, apparently dangerous attack. So black has very good defensive resources in these variations. So just to take a look at a couple more moves here. So again, it looks very scary, but there are enough pieces around the black king that His defensive resources are pretty good. Okay, anyway, you guys can look that up in the database if you want. It's probably played in the U.S. Championship. I assume that's what the event was. So, New York 1966. All right. Well, here Wolff pulled out a novelty. He played d5. And it's a new move, but not again, a new idea per se. I mean, Black likes to play d5 in many Sicilians if he can get away with it, as it really opens up a lot of space for his pieces, especially the bishop on c8, which is obviously kind of locked in at the moment. And also just another point is that after, let's say, e takes d5, knight takes d5, takes and takes, well, we can take everything out here. White's now missing this knight on c3, which is a very useful defender. Of course, you could say the same thing about Black, not having his knight on f6 anymore, but the difference is that Black has an open c-file, and White doesn't have a corresponding open f-file. So this seems to favor Black a little bit. And in fact, also with the move bishop to f6, that shows another benefit of the exchange, that this bishop can find its way now to a really excellent square. So ideally, if Black could get away with it, he'd put the bishop on f6, the other bishop on f5, play knight to b4, and the attack will prove quite dangerous. So White should probably play g4 here, in part to play g5 at some point, but really more immediately to prevent bishop to f5. So Black should probably play bishop to d7, and here he would be slightly better. Despite the isolated pawn, what really counts is the activity of the pieces, and Black has reasonable attacking chances. His pawn on d5 isn't especially exposed, and the e5 square is maybe a nice jumping off point for his knight as well. So lots of good play for Black. So for that reason, after Wolff's d5, White should not make the capture. Another possibility is to play queen f2. This looked pretty logical, lining up for bishop to b6, and it looks like whatever Black would have to do would prove kind of inconvenient. If he moves the rook away, well, either it's going to go to d6 or d7, which are both pretty awkward squares, or the queen will have to, or to leave the d-file, which is certainly a victory for White, or perhaps the queen will have to leave c7, or again, maybe another possibility, which also looks quite unattractive, is retreating the knight to d7 to control that square. So, and that would drop the d-pawn if nothing else. But Black has simple tactical resource, d takes e4, and after bishop to b6, you can simply exchange on d1 with a perfectly good game. So Christiansen chose a third alternative. He played king to b1. And this is, it's just a very kind of standard but useful move in many Sicilians where you have this opposite side castling. It gets off of the c-file, so that's, there's no worry about queen takes c2 mate. Even if queen takes c2 happens at some point, it won't be checkmate. And also gets off the c1 h6 diagonal. Let me put an arrow there for those of you who are not super hip to chess notation. So we get off of that diagonal, and there can be tactical tricks there too. So it's just kind of a useful move to make, and it also protects the a2 pawn. So that way, if in some variation Black's queen comes to a5, looks unlikely here because of the knight on b3, but it's not very rare in the Sicilian. Then again, we don't have to worry about any problems for White with the a2 pawn. So it's a useful move. It's it's not forcing, but you can think of it as kind of the completion of castling for White in the Sicilian. Okay, well now Black could play d takes e4, and in fact does take the pawn, but you might think that he should even build up with bishop to b4. But it looks like simply bishop to d2, breaking the pin, is adequate. So I think that White is in completely fine shape here. So d takes e4 seems to me to be right. Now Christiansen trades the rooks, and then plays f takes e4. The reason for making this trade is that if he lets Black make the trade, then either the queen's going to go back to d1 where it's not really ideally suited. I mean, it's much better with the queen having the option of going to some square on the king side. f2, g3, h4, it'll have to wait and see, but any of these would be more promising than d1 and maybe going to f3, probably. The other possible recapture would be with a knight, and this isn't really very attractive either. I mean, the knight does nothing there, and we'll probably want to go back to c3 at some point to try to clog up the c-file. Okay, so let's get rid of all of this. and move on. So rook d8, and then f takes e4. Okay, so b5. And I'd have to say, I mean, structurally, black is in terrific shape. White's kingside pawns are kind of loose, and it doesn't really look, at least at first glance, like white really has much of anything. I mean, 3 pieces are still in the back rank. These knights on c3 and b3 are far away from black's kingside, and while this bishop on e3 does look kind of aggressively posted, it really can't do anything by itself. Now, you might think white wants to play something like g4 and g5, and that may be true, but he's got to be kind of careful about this. I mean, first of all, if nothing else, black can probably meet g4 with knight to h7, and in the process erect a really solid blockade of this g5 square. So let's make all these red here for black. So it's not quite so clear how exactly white's going to make progress. Meanwhile, black can consider, let's say, finishing his development, bishop b7. Oops. Bishop b7. Oops, there we go. Come on, red arrow. All right, got it. Bishop to b7, maybe b4, rook c8. And all of his pieces are going to find their way to really terrific squares. While, thanks to white's again weak structure and kind of spread apart development, it's a little bit tougher for him to do so. All right, so white played bishop to d3, and this is quite sensible. It overprotects the c2 pawn, and maybe someday white can play e5 and hope for some kind of mischief on this diagonal. Now that looks like a fantasy at this point, but wait and see. Stay tuned. All right, now here I think black should just play natural, healthy, developing moves like bishop to e7, and frankly, he's probably slightly better here. It looks as if white's structure is weak enough that black should probably have a small edge. So not a lot. I mean, it's still a very, very complicated position, and we'll probably see white throw the kitchen sink at black. But if bishop to e7 at least appears to me to give black a sufficiently solid and healthy position. Unfortunately, he played queen to e5, and while sometimes this kind of queen centralization can be really useful, it doesn't seem to me what black really needed at the moment. So with 3 pieces that are all still languishing here on the back rank, I think he would have been better served to finish his development first. And in fact, as we'll see, queen to e5 ends up losing a couple of tempi. All right, well here for starters, Christiansen plays queen to e2, keeping black's knight off of g4, and perhaps giving himself the option of playing g4. Now Wolff played bishop to e7, and here Christiansen makes a very nice move. All right, so you might want to stop the recording here and see if you can figure out what he did, or maybe what he should do. Not sure that it's necessarily the best move, but I think it is a good move. Okay, well the move chosen by Christiansen is g3. Just a little move, but one with quite a punch. The point, of course, is that he wants to play bishop to f4, and that traps the queen. So it's quite nice. It's not only driving the queen away, but it's driving the queen off the board, as a matter of fact. Furthermore, let's say it didn't trap the queen, that it had some flight square. Even so, he would follow up with e5, driving away black's good defensive knight from f6, opening the, so let me draw some more arrows here. So it opens this diagonal for the bishop, it clears e4 perhaps for this knight, and it drives black's knight away from f6. So it does a lot of very good things here. So black decides, rather than retreating his queen and just kind of saying, I was kidding with my queen to e5 move 2 moves ago, decided to bite the bullet and play queen takes g3. Now, this is really asking for trouble. So if any of you are familiar with Christiansen's chess, his style, his games, I mean, this guy is a tremendous attacker. And to just open up the g file like this, and you can see the idea of just rook to g1, followed by bishop takes h6. I mean, to go for this, even if it's good, it's not good against Christiansen. So you got to have really, really seriously strong nerves and self-confidence in your defensive abilities to play something like this. And it's probably still not a good idea for just a pawn. If you're getting a piece, maybe, but for one pawn, not what the doctor ordered here. All right. Well, of course, Christiansen played rook to g1, and here, kind of ironically, Black's best move is probably queen to e5. And the reason why is that although, of course, there's nothing that can be done about bishop takes h6, so that pawn's a goner in any case. But what it does do, besides attack the white h pawn a second time, is that it keeps white from playing e5. So white really wants to play e5 and clear all these lines for his pieces, for the bishop and the knight especially. So after queen to e5, bishop takes h6, knight h5, not really to take the pawn, but to cover the g7 square. That's the real point of knight takes h5. Okay, so queen to f3, and we'll see the idea behind this. Very subtle, g6, and now bishop to e2. And the threat is to just take the knight on h5, surprisingly. Now, what's even more surprising is that this is really a threat that Black should in fact allow. For one thing, he can't play knight to f6, because if he does, then bishop to f4 is winning material. The queen's trapped yet again, and on queen to h5, white can simply take twice and win. All right. Likewise, knight to g7 isn't very good. Bishop f4, and now queen to g2, and the queen can't get out, can't get sideways. And when it goes back, let's say to some horrible square like h7, rook h1, and he's practically getting buried alive here. And I think he's probably losing material. Maybe queen h4 will avert an immediate catastrophe, but the problems on the h-file should prove to be fatal sooner or later. Okay, so the best move here for Black, though, is the surprising bishop to d7, simply disregarding the threat altogether. And after queen takes h5, takes, there's king to h7. And one of the two white bishops is lost. Black's still up a pawn, but white regains it here, and in fact gets an extra. But after rook to f8, this bishop on f7 is trapped. So it can't go to g6, because knight to e5, and now it really is trapped and lost. So the only thing that white can really do here is to play rook to h1 check and go for a kind of perpetual here. Black's king doesn't want to go to g7, because then bishop to h5 and bishop f3, assuming rook to h8, and the bishop escapes. So king to g5 is best, so that way on bishop to h5, rook h8, bishop f3, takes, and Black's king is incredibly active, and it will compensate for the pawn. So rook to g1 is best, king h6, and both sides should simply repeat the moves here. Okay, so back to rook to g1, saying this is what would happen on queen to e5, and I think there Black can just about keep the balance. Maybe white can find something else, but it's even that line certainly puts Black under serious pressure. After the move chosen by Wolff, however, queen to h3, he's now in serious trouble. And the big difference is that after bishop takes h6, knight takes h5, the move that we've been heavily foreshadowing, e5, proves to be very problematic for Black to handle. Now, it's not just generically good. In fact, white has a serious threat, queen to e4, which threatens to give mate, queen h7 and queen to h8, and of course threatens to take the knight on c6. So this is already a big uh-oh moment for Black. So he plays bishop to b7, which is pretty much forced, queen to e4, and now Black could try to block off the diagonal, let's say with queen to with g6. But if he does this, then, well, you tell me, or maybe don't tell me, but figure it out yourself, and I'll tell you in a moment, but I'm sure you'll be able to find this without too much difficulty. Okay, the answer, of course, is rook takes g6 check, and this forces mate, whether Black takes the rook or not. If he plays king to h8, well, he will have to take the rook no matter what. It's just a question of where. White plays rook to g8 check, and queen to h7 mate. And if instead f takes g6, then the more familiar mate with queen takes g6 and queen h7 comes into play. So g6 is not going to be successful here for Black. Alright, so the move that Wolff played was king to f8, and this is fine. And here, once again, let me challenge you to see if you can find what Christiansen should have played. So here I think he made really his only significant inaccuracy of the game, certainly of the attacking phase of the game. Okay, well, hopefully you've tried to find it. I think it'll prove quite interesting and instructive. The move that Christiansen played, queen to h7, is very, very natural. So he threatens queen to h8 mate. He's hitting this pawn yet again, and black is certainly still in trouble here. However, as we'll see, black had a defense in the game, but he wouldn't have had a defense had Christiansen played bishop takes g7 check. Now, the obvious tactical justification is that after knight takes g7, white has rook to h1, and that just wins on the spot, because if the queen moves, let's say it goes to f5, rook to h8 is just checkmate. So black has to cough up the queen here, but then white is going to be ahead in material and with a decisive attack to boot. So the more interesting response is not capturing, but king to e8. So material's even here, and it looks as if white's pieces are far enough away from the black king that he has some chances to survive. As it turns out, though, white has a very nice series of blows that prove that the king isn't safe in the center either, starting with knight takes b5. Very attractive move. Of course, it wins a pawn. It also threatens knight to c7. And after a takes b5, bishop b5, now piling up on the knight. And it seems that no matter what black does, he's basically crushed here. If he tries king to d7, excuse me, then white plays rook to h1, switching gears here, and in that way he'll win the knight on h5, because the queen will probably play, let's say the queen goes to f5, whoops, didn't mean to do that. Queen goes to f5, then takes, rook h5. If you want to play the pawn f5, I mean, it'll be kind of the same thing. If nothing else, I mean, we can still play rook h3 and rook takes h5. So king to d7 doesn't save black. If he tries rook to c8 instead, probably rook to h1 is still okay, but knight to a5 is good enough as well. So hitting the bishop on b7 and tripling up on this knight on c6, something's got to give here, and it's going to be black. So bishop takes g7 looks like it would have been decisive, but queen h7 is practically speaking very, very strong as well. Okay, black played king to e8. He has to give himself a flight square. Now white played bishop takes g7, and here black missed a very difficult but seemingly adequate defensive resource. So he could have played queen e3, and surprisingly, it looks like this holds. Now, the point of this is that black probably wouldn't mind playing knight takes g7, but obviously he can't do that with the queen hanging on h3. So by playing queen to e3, he gets his queen out of the way with tempo, because he's hitting the rook, and then he can take on g7. And that gives him, among other things, the possibility of playing bishop to f8 after he makes the exchange. So after knight takes, then bishop to f8 is a reasonable reply to any back rank checks from the queen. So nice defensive idea, and just to show some lines, if rook to d1, for example, trying to cut off the black king from going to the queen side, then knight takes g7, and here knight e4 poses some difficulties, but again it looks like black can hold everything. So knight takes e5, queen check, bishop f8, and now a couple of different drawing lines. The simplest way for white to draw is bishop takes b5, and then knight f6, g8 forever, with a draw by perpetual. Okay, if white tries knight to f6, black could probably still, well, black doesn't want to play the king to d8 because he loses the bishop on f8 and then other stuff. So king to e7. Now knight to g8 can be met by king to d8, but queen to h4 still poses some problems here, threatening various queen-winning discovered checks from the knight. So black has to, but can, play the risky and bold-looking king to d6. Now, the nice thing for black is that almost all of his pieces are on dark squares, and the pieces that are on light squares, the bishop and the rook, well, the rook can't be gotten to by the bishop, while bishop to e4, simply king c7 and everything's protected. So white needs to prove an attack, and the best move is the ironic rook to e1. So not only does he not discharge this battery on the d-file, but he actually moves the rook off the d-file. Okay, so rook to e1, queen to b6, queen f4. That's the big point behind rook e1. Now black has to return the material, but after king c7, queen e5, queen d6, it really just doesn't seem that white has anything special here. So material is slightly in black's favor. He's got an extra pawn, and he's more or less managed to quote-unquote castle queenside now, and it seems to be safe. So queen c3, queen c6, and there's probably nothing better than going for some sort of perpetual check here for white. Okay, so that was what happens on rook to d1, back here after queen to e3. If white tries rook to f1, aiming at the f7 pawn, of course, then once again knight takes g7, and now white has a very nice blow, but again it doesn't quite win. Rook takes f7. So this is a terrific move, and if king takes f7, there's a nice little mate in two here. But black plays queen to g1 check, and now there's no bishop to g6. So you can see, I mean, if he plays, let's say, knight to c1, king takes rook, bishop g6, queen g6. Okay, so that's obviously not possible. So the only good move here for white is rook to f1, and now black goes to g3. So the knight stays protected, and the black king is still ready to run away to d7. So white has to play bishop to g6 to regain the piece. But in this position here, material is even, and again, black's king has more or less managed to find its way to safety. And with the well-centralized queen, the bishop pair, and basically all of his pieces now reaching good squares, black is fine. Alright, so this would not have been easy to find, this queen to e3 move. But had he done so, he probably would have had, I don't know that he would have found everything, or that Christiansen would have found some other ideas, but basically I think he would have been okay. Alright, instead he played king to d7, which is very natural. I mean, we saw a lot of lines where black plays that anyway. I mean, he does want to try to get out of dodge over there, but Christiansen finds more terrific resources to keep his opponent really under the gun. All right, so once again, try to figure out if you can, how white can continue the prosecution of his attack. Rook to d1 looks like a natural kind of move. Maybe moving the bishop from g7 to hit the f pawn. What should black play? Or sorry, what should white play here? So see if you can find this. Okay, well the answer is a very pretty move, knight to d5. So what does this do? Well, it has a threat. First of all, it threatens to play knight to b6 check. Secondly, it prevents black from escaping with his king to c7, which would be quite convenient. Third, of course, the knight can't be taken, obviously enough, because if e takes d5, bishop to f5 forks the king and the queen. And maybe a fourth point to this move is that there's no queen to e3 now, so the black queen can't escape the pin on the h-file, at least not in that way. So this is really a terrific move by Christiansen. Very, very creative and very powerful. All right, another point, okay, if queen to h2, which looks pretty plausible, knight to b6 check, and it turns out that white wins the exchange with check, so he is able to collect, because, let's say, king to d8, queen to h8 check, and now the king has to go to c7, and white simply gets to enjoy a decisive material advantage, as well as still some continued attacking chances. Alright, so going back to the position after knight to d5, Wolff's move was very intelligent, rook to d8. So he gets out of the fork, and he also prepares to finish castling queenside with king to c8. So this looks quite logical. Alright, white plays knight to f6 check, and now we see a further point. Okay, if black simply plays king to c8, which he does, white plays queen takes h5, and he's basically up a piece for nothing here. And that's, in fact, what happened. So let's take a look at bishop takes f6, which is the only way to try to at least keep the game going here. Okay, bishop takes f6, attacking the rook and the f7 pawn. So rook to f8 is what we should expect. Queen to h6, pardon me, hitting the rook. And if, let's say, king to e8, because there's also the threat of knight to c5 in some cases too. So king e8 gets out of both, knight c5, bishop c8. And here, see if you can figure out what white should do to win the game. So obviously he's got a tremendous position. Probably you would think there's got to be more than one really strong move here. But this, I think, is especially strong and attractive. Okay, well, hopefully some of you thought of the move bishop to h7. Knight to e4 certainly looks like a good move, and it probably is quite strong. And maybe bishop to e2, maybe queen h2 avoids any big disaster. But bishop to h7 is a fantastic move, and it comes with the crushing threat of queen takes f8 check, king f8, and rook to g8 mate. So that's the big point. I mean, otherwise bishop to h7 would be kind of strange, putting the bishop on this kind of funny out-of-the-way square, but that's the big idea. And the problem is that it's very hard for black to really deal with this. Really, the only move he can play that stops it without losing crushing loads of material is knight to e7, covering the g8 square. But now after knight to e4, I mean, it's a really kind of amusing situation. I mean, black is just about completely gift-wrapped here. And white threatens, among other things, knight to d6 check, followed by queen takes f8 check. Also, another possibility might be rook to d1, followed by queen takes f8, and then rook to d8 mate. So all kinds of neat possibilities here. It's simply target practice for Christiansen in this position. So I'm sure Wolff saw a lot of variations at least like this, maybe that one too, and decided to simply give up the piece and perhaps hope that white's pieces being strewn about here and there, maybe something would become loose. Perhaps the players were in time pressure. I didn't check the times for this game. So in any case, he played queen to e3, attacking the rook and doubling the attack on the e pawn. White played rook to c1. And this is perfectly reasonable. And the only reason why I want to point out this move is that it looks like it's entirely passive. But Christiansen, with his flair for the attack, is the sort of player who will find a way to put the rook where it's not just out of the way of attacks from black's pieces, but will prove to be a fine, well-functioning attacking unit on c1. So stick around. Okay, black plays knight takes e5, and white plays bishop to h6, which is a nice move, taking advantage of the chance to do it with tempo. I mean, if the queen weren't on e3, or I should say under attack from the bishop, then the knight on f6 would be hanging. So it's of course important that white is hitting the queen here. And this is, again, a very useful move for white to make. He'd like to bring his bishop, if he can, onto this diagonal, where it's clearly going to put some serious pressure on black's king. So black plays queen to g3, keeping his knight on e5 protected, so that white's queen can't get it, and also, obviously, keeping white's bishop off of f4. So knight to e4, and now the only way that black can avoid losing the knight on e5 is to play bishop takes e4. So he does it. Bishop e4, and now f5. So this kicks the bishop, and it blocks the queen on h5's line to the knight on e5. So he's doing a little safeguarding there. All right, well, once again, this is a good position to try to figure out what white's move ought to do. So unfortunately, just my asking the question will maybe clue you into looking at some moves that you might not have looked at otherwise. Now, sometimes that's the price you have to pay. But still, even if you find the idea here, it's still quite nice. So do what you can. See if you can find the best way for white to proceed here, and calculate it out. So don't just look for the one or two moves, but see how deeply you can analyze it as well. Okay, well, the move chosen by white is the very forceful bishop takes f5, and I suspect probably that most of you were able to find this move. And after the capture, there's queen takes f5, and the simplest point is that if black plays, for example, rook to d7, bishop to f4 regains the extra piece, and leaves white, way ahead of material, a piece and a pawn up, and with a crushing attack. But the key thing is, what happens on knight to d7? So here, black doesn't lose the piece back right away. All right, well, white plays bishop to f4, and this is cutting through the heart of black's position here on the queen side, and white would like to follow up with a move like queen to e4, or queen to e6, or queen d5, all of which threaten, among other things, queen to c6, which would be mate. So black plays queen to f3, really the only move. It's the only way to stop all three of those, because, queen to e4, queen to d5 would hang the queen, while queen to e6 would hang the bishop and allow black to avoid the mate. So that's why queen f3 is good and queen to g2 isn't. That still allows queen to e6. All right, but after queen to f3, the drawback of this move is that now white brings the knight into play with, again, gain of time. Knight to d4, queen to b7, and now the game ends in one move. You probably guessed it, especially with the foreshadowing that I made earlier, c4. If black takes on c4, then he's simply losing everything and probably getting mated directly. So b takes c4, rook c4 check, and if the queen interposes, of course the queen's just lost. The knight can't interpose because it's pinned, and bishop c5, rook takes c5 simply pushes the inevitable off by one move, and then black has to throw the queen away. All right, well, we don't have to play b takes c4, and we don't have to allow c takes b5. We can play b4. The problem now, though, is the white plays c5, and there's absolutely no good reply, to c6. I mean, black can play bishop takes c5, but then rook takes c5, and we just end up pretty much with what we looked at with b takes c4. And other than that, c6 is inevitable, crushing, and a good reason for black to resign, which, as I said, he did after the move c4. So a beautiful attacking win by Larry Christiansen. I don't remember exactly where I voted this game. It was around here. I think it was maybe number 3. So it was within a spot of where it actually ended up. So a game that, again, highlights his strong point, his real flair, his genius for the attack. And poor Wolff, shouldn't have played queen takes g3. He should have known better, just from years and years of knowing and playing Christiansen, that even if it's a good move, it's a bad move, to put it in a kind of a pithy way. So thanks a lot, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the game and the presentation, and I'll see you next week with the number 3 game. And meanwhile, let me again invite you to check out my blog at chessmind.powerblogs.com. Thank you very much, and see you next week. Bye.